Today, we're diving into one of the most influential and, one of the most controversial political theories of the last half-century, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. It's this really bold idea that completely flipped the script on how we think about global conflict after the Cold War ended.
So I want you to imagine it's the early 1990s. The Berlin Wall is rubble, the Soviet Union has just collapsed, and for the first time in like 50 years, the world isn't defined by this epic struggle between capitalism and communism. So the biggest question on absolutely everyone's mind was, what now? What's the next thing that's going to cause conflict?
And out of that uncertainty, two major viewpoints really came to the forefront. On one side, you had Francis Fukuyama and his really optimistic idea of the end of history. He basically said, look, Western liberal democracy has won. Game over. But then, on the other side, you had this political scientist, Samuel Huntington, who came in with a much, much darker prediction, that the future wasn't about the end of conflict, but the beginning of a whole new era of cultural conflict.
So, to really get Huntington's theory, you first have to understand the world it was born into. This was a moment of just massive global uncertainty. Think about it. For nearly half a century, the entire world was split into these two ideological camps. Your identity was crystal clear. You were either with the West or you were with the Soviets. And then poof, that was gone. It just disappeared, leaving this huge vacuum. All the old rules of the game just didn't apply anymore, and people started looking for new identities, new groups to belong to.
And this is exactly where Samuel Huntington steps onto the stage. He looked at this messy, unstructured new world and proposed a pretty radical new way of making sense of it all.
Okay, this right here, this is the absolute heart of his entire argument. He predicted that the big divisions, the main source of conflict, were going to be cultural. And the key thing to get here is that he's shifting the focus away from things like nation-states and economics and putting it right on culture.
So, what did he even mean by civilization? Well, it wasn't about countries or governments. For him, a civilization is the biggest we you can possibly belong to. It's that highest level of cultural identity, the thing defined by a shared history, language, religion, and customs.
And so he basically drew up a new map of the world, dividing it into these major civilizational groups: Western, Islamic, Confucian, which he sometimes called Cynic, Hindu, Orthodox, and so on. This was his new global map, and it wasn't based on political borders, but on these deep historical cultural connections.
Okay, so if these civilizations are the new big players on the world stage, where is the conflict actually going to happen? Well, Huntington had a very specific idea for that, and he called them fault lines. He used this really powerful analogy from geology. You know, like geological fault lines where tectonic plates grind against each other and cause earthquakes. He saw cultural fault lines exactly like that, the places where these massive civilizations meet and rub up against each other. He argued these borders would be the flashpoints for all the future crises and wars.
And this is where the theory gets really concrete. Huntington started pointing to specific fault lines. You know, the ongoing tensions between the West and the Islamic world, the intense rivalry between Hindu India and Islamic Pakistan, and that growing competition between the Confucian sphere, led by China, and the West. To him, these weren't just random conflicts, they were fundamentally civilizational.
His theory was also built on a few other key ideas. He talked a lot about the West versus the rest, arguing that Western power was on the decline as other civilizations were rising and reasserting their own cultures. He even predicted a kind of Confucian-Islamic alliance forming to push back against the West. But maybe most importantly, he saw people's identities shifting away from their country and back towards their deeper cultural and religious roots.
As you can probably imagine, this theory was absolutely explosive. It sparked a massive, massive debate, and it didn't take long for the criticisms to come rolling in hard. Critics basically said this is way too simplistic. It paints entire civilizations with one giant brush, totally ignoring the huge diversity inside them. I mean, think about the differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims, for example. They also said it ignores other crucial causes of conflict, like economics or political power. And maybe worse, some argued it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, actually encouraging people to see the world in these divisive us versus them terms. And that phrase he used, Islam's bloody borders, drew a ton of fire for being deeply biased.
So, with all that heavy criticism, why are we even still talking about this? Well, because for better or for worse, the theory has been incredibly sticky. It continues to pop up and shape conversations about the world we live in today.
It's funny. Even its harshest critics have to admit that Huntington's framework is still a go-to reference point.
Decades later, whenever some kind of identity-based conflict flares up somewhere in the world, his theory is one of the first things people reach for to try and make sense of it.
And you can really see why it endures when you look at this. I mean, think about the global political landscape after 9/11. Think about the strategic competition with a rising China, or the huge surge in nationalism and identity politics we're seeing all over the world. A lot of people look at these major trends and see the echoes of Huntington's predictions, which is why his ideas just keep resonating.
In the end, the book's impact was just profound. It really forced political scientists to start taking culture and religion seriously as major drivers in global politics. It completely shattered that optimism of the post-Cold War world, and it introduced this idea, which is now pretty common, of a world with multiple, competing centers of power and culture. And ironically, by warning everyone about a clash, it actually pushed a lot of people to work harder on cross-cultural dialogue and understanding.
And that brings us to the final, really big question, the one that sits at the very heart of this entire debate. Is Huntington's framework really the best way to see the world? Or does focusing so much on these civilizational clashes make us miss the deeper connections, the shared values, the common humanity that might actually unite all of us? It's a question that feels just as urgent today as it did when he first asked it.